We're especially honored today to welcome a truly distinguished panel of speakers, beginning with our very own Maryland State Senator, Jeff Waldstreicher. Jeff, will you stand up for 1 second? I think everyone knows you, but a bit of a hero, I think. He was the chief sponsor of Senate Bill 1, the Gun Safety Act of 2023. This passed last session in the Maryland legislature. And this is wonderful news, which he will tell us more about. And we want to thank you, Senator Waldstreicher, for your leadership in making that passage possible and burnishing Maryland's record really as a state leader in this area. But honestly, we know that even as we applaud this incredibly positive step, we know there's so much more that needs urgently to be done. We're holding this forum on the eve of yet another mass shooting. 8 people dead, 7 wounded, so many friends, families, and communities impacted. And guess what? That is not the whole story, as we know. Every day, there's shootings that do not end up in the newspapers. The status quo in America today, in my view, is unconscionable and absolutely untenable. And you know the statistics, and we keep seeing the brutal reality of burgeoning gun violence scrolling across our screens and our newsfeed. And we know, as I just said, that as horrific as that is, it is just the tip of the iceberg. So St. John's and our colleagues in faith communities throughout this region, colleagues like Temple Sinai, a leader in the fight against gun violence, and our co-hosts today. Anyone here from Temple Sinai today? We may have people online. We are working hard for change. But I want to make it clear that we do so recognizing the Second Amendment and the right of every American to own firearms responsibly. And indeed, we are convinced that the voice and the support of the responsible gun owner, the gun owner who understands the lethal nature of firearms and the critical need for gun safety, these are essential if our lawmakers are going to take steps needed to stop the senseless killing. And maybe later I'll ask Senator Waldstreicher what he thinks about that part of the discussion. And it's here that we can see some hope in the fact that the voices of responsible gun owners, many of whom are here today, are increasingly being raised and they are being heard. We're very fortunate today to have the opportunity to hear from a leader who has engaged himself in raising up the voices of responsible gun owners. And we are welcoming via Zoom Michael Littman. Michael, can we spotlight Michael? Good morning, Michael. Can you hear us? All good? Michael Littman is the executive director of a relatively new national organization called 97%. Has anyone here heard of 97%? Yay, you'll be absolutely delighted then to hear from Michael. But this is the only nationwide organization that I'm aware of that's entirely focused on engaging gun owners to help reduce gun-related deaths in America. 97% is doing that by trying to change the conversation around gun safety to be more inclusive of gun owners who care about this issue, to utilize technology to create safer communities, and most importantly, from my point of view right now for our today's event, they are doing all kinds of original research to identify areas of common ground to reduce gun violence, common ground that can be supported by gun owners and non-gun owners alike. And our third and final speaker today is doing exactly that kind of research. Dr. Michael Siegel. Michael, where are you? There you are, up on the top there. Welcome this morning. Dr. Michael Siegel of Tufts University School of Medicine is joining us by Zoom from Boston. He has researched gun violence for the past 9 years with a focus on the effectiveness of state firearm laws in preventing firearm homicide and suicide. But most recently, his important research was for 97%. And he focused on interviewing many representatives of gun organizations, gun owners, to identify effective policies to reduce gun violence and gun deaths that are widely supported by gun owners and non-gun owners alike. And he's come up with a list of specific things where there is that broad support. And I know that you will enjoy hearing about that from him. So we have so much to learn and discuss today. I'm going to turn now to Senator Waldstreicher for remarks, and after that to Matt Littman, and then to Michael Siegel, and then we'll take questions. Thank you so much again for coming. Senator Waldstreicher. Please.
Well, thank you to each and every one of you. Thank you to Margaret for inviting me here today. Thank you to Reverend Derse for the incredible invitation and remarks here this morning. So as Reverend Derse mentioned, we join here in the wake of yet another mass shooting, this time out of Dallas, Texas. Of course, we pray in this church and throughout this community and this state for the victims and the victims' families. But of course, we also know that prayers are not enough. They were not enough after Uvalde, not enough after Buffalo, not enough after Sandy Hook. What is necessary, what is needed, what is critical right now is action and laws and policy and a distinct change in our very American culture when it comes to guns. I'm fortunate to be able to say that Maryland is doing just that. It started back in 2013. And I was in the legislature then, and where other states refused to act out of after the mass shooting in Sandy Hook, Maryland decided to move forward. And we passed a series of bills, all of which have been upheld by our court, including the Firearms Safety Act of 2013. Many of you saw the weapon, a photograph of the weapon that was used last night outside Dallas. It is an AR-15 style assault weapon. This is not a gun. This is a weapon of war. In 2013, joining with then Senator Brian Frosch and then Senator Jamie Raskin, we banned assault rifles in Maryland. And then we built upon that law. We passed universal background checks, and we passed an ERPO law, an extreme risk protective order law, better known as a red flag law, so that people who are a danger to themselves or others don't have access to firearms in Maryland. And there's sometimes in our community, especially those like me who believe we need to regulate guns, just a sense of helplessness because we see lots of our country going the other direction. But our actions after 2013, after Sandy Hook, proved that helplessness is not a natural condition, that what we really need to do is push forward with these critical policies. And that's exactly what we did. And it provided momentum for further action. So after that initial package, after Sandy Hook, we continued to move forward and we passed a ban on ghost guns. Ghost guns are guns without serial numbers that are often made and assembled from parts that you can order online. And so we were making real progress year by year, legislative session by legislative session. And then a case came down from the United States Supreme Court called Bruin. Two of our neighbors here in the Bethesda Chevy Chase area wrote that opinion. And at its core, I mean, it's a 135-page opinion, but at its core, what it essentially creates is a default that guns are allowed anywhere at any time by anyone. And what we realized that we had to do here in Maryland was to act in response to that opinion, but to do so responsibly, to do so in a way that conformed to the opinion, even if we believed it was wrong, to do so in a way that would be upheld by the very Supreme Court that passed, or excuse me, that wrote the Bruin decision. And this began a journey that began, I don't know, right around this time last year, or maybe a little bit later in June, and continued until April 11th, sine die, the final day of our legislative session. And so we passed a 3-bill package. And here's what we did. The first bill is a bill about licensing. We realized that our licensing scheme, which was essentially struck down in Bruin, was not as strong as it needed to be, and that people with severe mental health issues, people with criminal records, violent criminals, cannot and should not have access to weapons in Maryland. And so working with my colleague, Delegate Luke Clippinger, who authored the bill, we passed among the strongest, most stringent licensing bills in the entire United States. And I'm incredibly proud of that. But we didn't just end there. So much of the violence that we've seen is not just these mass shootings, but especially among teenagers, folks who have access to their parents' weapons. In Maryland, it was not required that adults secure their weapons against child access. And children, especially teenagers, use weapons not only to commit violence against other teenagers, especially in our schools, but also to commit suicide. And this is an epidemic in our society. It's been especially prevalent in the post-COVID world. And we knew we needed to step up and pass a law ensuring child access prevention in Maryland. And that's exactly what we did. We call it Jalen's Law. Jalen was a teenage girl who was shot in her school by a student who had access to his parents' weapon. And those parents were not found accountable for that action. And so on May 16th, coming up soon, Governor Westmore will be signing Jalen's Law with her mother, Melissa Willey, present for that bill signing. And I'm very excited about that. The last bill was my bill, and certainly one of the largest accomplishments of my legislative career. The Senate President gave me the honor of naming it Senate Bill 1. Usually the first bill of each session is designated by the presiding officer as something really critical and timely for the legislative session. And if you haven't had the opportunity to meet Bill Ferguson, I hope you do at some point. He's an incredible Senate president and doing wonderful things. He used to live here in Montgomery County. He went to Georgetown Prep, not far from here, and is now, I think at age 39, one of the youngest Senate presidents in Maryland history and one of the youngest across the country. And what he wanted to do and what I wanted to do and what I know you wanted to do was to push back against the Bruin decision's new cultural norm that guns can come anywhere, because there are certain sensitive places that guns should not be allowed. And in fact, Bruin said exactly that. We're going to create this new default, guns everywhere, but not in courthouses, which should not shock you given that it's written by judges, not in legislative bodies. And so our job was to think, well, what other analogous sensitive locations are there where guns should not be allowed ever, even if you have a permit? And these, over the course of months, these sensitive locations started to form. And of course, that includes schools, it includes churches and synagogues and mosques. It includes any place where alcohol might be served because of the effect on alcohol on people's judgment and their ability to make decisions. It includes our casinos and other places where you gamble. It includes our stadiums like FedEx Stadium and M.P.H Stadium in Baltimore. It is an entire list of places that we think are constitutionally defensible where guns cannot and should not be allowed. This was a heavy lift, and I'll tell you why. I don't want to get partisan. This is not a partisan place. In Maryland, we still have conservative Democrats. That doesn't describe me, but I think that's a good thing, because as someone who promotes Democratic priorities, with conservative Democrats, I can get their vote 80% of the time. With Republicans, I can get their vote 0% of the time. But conservative Democrats often represent areas where guns are prevalent and where gun culture is part of the history and tradition of their communities. And so we knew that we needed to convince many of our colleagues from more conservative parts of the state that it was the right thing to do. And as we went along in this process and rewrote the bill and vetted the bill with the support of so many people here, and including the opponents of the bill, who I think pressured us and pushed us to make a stronger and more constitutionally defensible bill, we did get the votes of the vast majority of the legislature, making sure that the minority party could not filibuster. And then, of course, in the House, they had the votes as well. I think my colleague, Delegate Jared Solomon, might be joining us via Zoom. And I want to thank him and the rest of my team, Delegate Emily Shetty, Delegate Aaron Kaufman, for supporting this bill. We are a part-time legislature, so we have a firm end date. And if something doesn't pass by the last day, it doesn't pass at all. And we have to come back 9 months later to begin the process anew. And because this bill was so large and because it took a while to get through that process, it was up on the last day of session. And I was a little bit nervous. But it came up around 4 p.m. and it's my honor to say that we have passed Senate Bill 1, that guns are disallowed in sensitive places. We passed the stringent licensing bill. We passed Jalen's law. And in combination, these 3 bills are the strongest legislative package in the United States this year, and the strongest legislative package that we've passed in Maryland since 2013. So please give yourselves a round of applause. Thank you. So what's next? Well, 2 things are next. All of these bills will be challenging over the course of the next 5 to 7 years across this country. Laws like this law will get litigated out. Why so long? Well, we know that the Heller law, the Heller decision that was written in 2008 took until Bruin in 2022 to litigate out. So this will take a while. But in the meantime, we know that we still have more work to do in Maryland. So you probably have heard that there is gun industry immunity, and that is true at the federal level, but it is not true at the state level. We have the ability to hold gun manufacturers accountable in Maryland. I think the next step is to come back in January next year and pass what's called a PLCA repeal, which is just a jargony way of saying we're going to hold the gun manufacturers accountable for their dangerous product. So that's what's coming next. I want to thank so many of you for lobbying in Annapolis, for being supportive of these pieces of legislation. Let me point out 2 people who I saw here earlier. Jan McNamara is here. Jan was directly impacted, as many of you know. And Giselle Merck is here. Giselle's son. There's Jan and there's Giselle. You are an inspiration to me. You are an inspiration to all legislators and all of us in the community. Thank you so much for having me here today. Thank you.
Okay, and now we'll turn to Zoom to hear from Matt Littman of 97%.
So first, thank you for having me today. It's great to see such a big turnout because I think, we all have in common that we care about this issue a lot. I'm going to explain what 97% is, how it started, what we're doing, and then Dr. Siegel, the very esteemed Dr. Siegel, will speak afterward and tell you about the specific project that we're working on right now. So 97%, like all of you, people caring very much about this issue, a couple of philanthropists, I'm in Los Angeles, reached out to me. They're here as well. What could we do about gun issues that are different, if anything, than what anybody else is doing? So we spent almost a full year meeting with legislators, law enforcement, all sorts of people, academics, about what organizations are doing and if there is room for another organization. Because as you know, and as you're hearing about today, there are lots of organizations doing great work on gun issues now, but it's also pretty obvious that we have not moved far enough. So in other words, 97% in a poll support universal background checks. There's nothing more popular than universal background checks, but we can't get these very basic things done. Why not? So a couple of our meetings were with former police chief Bill Bratton. If you remember Bill Bratton, he was the police chief in New York, Los Angeles, and I think Boston, and Richard Aborn, who ran the Brady campaign. And they were saying that they think that gun owners are mostly in the same place as non-gun owners, but they're not speaking up or they're not being heard. So we set out to prove that to be true, or to find out whether it was true. And we did surveys and polling and focus groups all around the country and in various swing states, and found out that in fact, 84% of gun owners favor background checks. In fact, more than 2/3 of NRA members, for example, favor background checks. So what is going on? Gun owners, we found out, don't trust the media and don't trust their elected officials. So they're reluctant to speak up about the issue. And so what we've done is we've continued in this vein of trying to bring gun owners and non-gun owners together, doing research over and over again on this issue, presenting it to members of Congress and putting our money where our mouths are. So as an example, you may have seen a Fox News poll about a week and a half ago of registered voters that showed overwhelming numbers favoring things like background checks and red flag laws. They worked with a company called Beacon Research in Boston. We worked with them about 1.5 years ago. And what we're able to do when we have that research is we can go to members of Congress, and we do, and we say, here's where gun owners are. And we go to the individual states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, where they're working on this type of legislation. And we're able to say, here's where gun owners are. So we take that and we meet with, for example, there's something called the Gun Violence Caucus in the House, which is about 170 Democrats led by Congressman Mike Thompson. And we're able to present that research to the group and talk about what gun owners actually believe and where the common ground is. So we do that. We just did this project with Dr. Siegel that I'll tell you about in a minute. But when we do this research, we meet with these groups, we meet with Republican legislators as well. So we go around and we talk to the Republicans, and I'll tell you about how they feel about this in a minute. I'm sure you want to know. And then we also do a couple of other things. One is we do, just like everybody else in America these days, we do a podcast series. And we have very much both sides of the issue join us. So people we disagree with, because we want to prove that you could disagree and have civilized conversation and talk about this issue. And perhaps there are areas of agreement. We do a off the record meeting with both sides of the gun issue every couple of months. We have one on Monday, and we see if there are any areas of agreement. So for example, last June, when Congress was conducting hearings and then doing legislation on the gun issue, our work came up in a lot of those hearings, but we're then able to go to Senator Murphy or Senator Cornyn and say, if you do this, which in this case was mental health exams and mental health stuff on red flag laws, ERPOs, as the senator said before, you will have bipartisan support. And we know that you'll have that. And they listen to us about these types of issues. So we do that. We have an annual conference where we'll have on, you probably by now know Fred Gutenberg and Amy Swearer from the Heritage Foundation on together, and they have a conversation, and we talk about areas of disagreement, and we talk about potential areas of agreement. We have invested in a company called Vera, V-A-R-A, that's in Albany, New York, and it makes a smart gun safe, in other words, fingerprint technology. So when you have your gun, you're able to store it safely. And the idea of it, from our perspective, is to prevent guns from being stolen, not just out of your home. But one thing that came up was that, for example, when people go to Atlanta Falcons football games, they leave their guns in their cars and they come back and their guns are gone. And we know that stolen guns are often used in crime. So this can be used in your car or in your home. Just to be clear, while these philanthropists have invested in it, there's no profit for them in it. Legally, the profit goes back into a nonprofit, if there ever is a profit. So we do that kind of thing as well. We work with gun rights organizations on how to secure your gun and on gun safety. So we try to do as much as we possibly can around this in a way that's a little bit different. So we recently did this study with Dr. Siegel. And while Dr. Siegel will tell you about the study, I'll tell you that we were on Capitol Hill like a month and a half ago, and we were on Capitol Hill last week, and we meet with Democrats and we meet with Republicans. And we find that because we talk to gun owners, that there's a lot of interest on both sides on what we're saying. So Republicans are very interested in hearing where gun owners are. And I'll tell you that for this group, very often the pushback we get, it's surprising, is we don't really hear people say, well, the NRA pushes back on this issue. You don't hear that much anymore. The unfortunate thing is that there are groups set up to the right of the NRA that they do hear from. For example, there's a group called the Gun Owners of America, and those groups lob hundreds of calls, probably thousands of calls. They're not huge. Some of these groups like the NRA is, and that has an influence on Republican elected officials. The other thing we often hear on the Republican side is, they agree, but don't want to take the lead on the issue. So that's another thing that we're working on. Another thing that we heard last week was Congresswoman Nancy Mace from South Carolina is going to introduce legislation on an Amber Alert for gun shootings. So in the last Congress, Congressman Cicilline from Rhode Island, who's a Democrat, introduced it. It passed. It was lobbied against at the last minute by some of these gun rights organizations. I don't think it ever came up for a vote in the Senate. Congresswoman Mace is going to do it now. Now, why is that important for us? Because it's an area where people might agree. And some of this is trust building between Democrats and Republicans. So while that legislation won't solve the problem of gun violence, it could be a good area for people to work together. And our thing is getting people to work together on this issue. So, you know, one thing that we heard when we were there and we're trying to be helpful on is Democrats have meetings on gun issues, Republicans less so, but they may have meetings on gun issues. We're trying to get them together for meetings on gun issues. We present our information to the administration as well, to the Biden administration. And so we can say to you that lots of people do incredible work on this issue. What's been happening hasn't worked so far. We need to think a little bit differently about what might work and what really has an effect on gun violence, a very big effect, which Dr. Siegel will tell you about in a second. But there are things that we can do that gun owners agree upon that will reduce the number of deaths with a gun significantly. So that's where we are. So we're going to continue to conduct research. We will continue to present that research to elected officials. Dr. Siegel, Olivia Troy, who ran national security for Mike Pence, is on our advisory board. She and Dr. Siegel spoke, for example, to the Maryland legislature a few weeks ago. We've spoken to folks in the, as I mentioned, in the Pennsylvania legislature and the California legislature. You obviously have an excellent senator. We'd be happy to talk to him as well. And I know that people love to bash their elected officials, but when they're really good, we should also say so. So congratulations to you for having one of the good ones. And that's what we do. So we will continue. People want to hear from us about where gun owners are. We'll continue to do annual surveys and a couple of surveys throughout the year. And we bring that information, as was said before. Our thing is a little different because that's all we do. We're only trying to bring it forth where gun owners and non-gun owners agree. And that's what we have, and that's what we're bringing to the table. So I thank all of you for being interested in this. I know, you know, another terrible, terrible incident yesterday. The thing about this is they're happening way too often, and we need to do something about it. So thank you for your time. And at the end, I'm happy to take any questions.
So now we'll turn to Dr. Michael Siegel, who will speak for about 15 minutes, and then we will turn to questions and answers. Okay. Michael.
Thank you so much, Reverend Derse. You know, yesterday, I sent a little text message to Matt in the afternoon. He may not want me to admit this to you publicly, but he is a New York Knicks fan. And the New York Knicks were having a terrible shooting performance in the first quarter. So I thought I'd send him a note, and I sent him a text saying, terrible shooting. And because of the world that we live in right now, he thought I was texting him not to tease him about the Knicks shooting, but just to inform him that there had been another mass shooting. And then that's how bad things are right now. And I wrote him back to say, no, actually, I was talking about the Knicks shooting. And little did I know, a few hours later, that we heard about what happened in Texas. So we are in a situation where it is, there's a tremendous amount of pessimism for good reason. I want to share a message of hope today, share a message of optimism. And I want to show you why there's reason to actually be optimistic that we can get ourselves out of this mess if we do the right thing and if we go about it the right way. So I'm going to share these slides with you, which hopefully we'll be able to see on the screen there. And so with generous funding from 97%, we did research to try to develop a gun policy platform that we thought would be supported by both sides. And so the first question is, you know, so what? So I'm here to present another gun platform. You've heard many of them. You know, you've heard plenty of 12-point plan. all kinds of plans. Well, what's different about our plan? So what's different about our plan are a number of things. First of all, what distinguishes this plan is that it was developed after extensive research. And there were three parts to the research. And again, we thank 97% for funding this project. So the first part was a very careful review of laws regarding the effectiveness of federal and state gun laws. So we looked at the evidence, the scientific evidence. Second, we did a national survey of over 1,000 gun owners, trying to identify areas of common ground and understand their attitudes about specific provisions of gun laws. And then third, we did focus groups and interviews with about 100 both gun owners and non-gun owners to get their opinions. The second thing that was different was that we extensively consulted with gun owners and with gun owner rights organizations. And we did this even before we developed the survey. We talked to gun owners specifically because we wanted to, number one, get the wording right on the questions. And number two, we wanted to find out what areas were that gun owners were concerned about. Were there areas where there could be potential wins for gun owners? And that brings us to our third thing that differentiates this research from others, is that we were specifically looking for the area of common ground between gun owners and non-gun owners. We weren't looking for where the controversies were. We wanted to define where we all agree. The fourth thing that was different is that we were looking for a small set of laws that could have the greatest impact. This slide shows a list of partial list of what turns out to be over 140 laws that we track in our database. And it's a ridiculous number of laws that there's no way you can, have a policy platform with so many different laws. And there's so many different ways to go about the issue. We wanted to simplify it and come up with a very small set of policies that all states could pursue. Number five, we wanted to find a set of policies that interfered minimally with the ability of law-abiding citizens to purchase guns, while at the same time maximizing the effectiveness. And this is kind of a fancy curve that shows you that we were looking for this kind of sensitive spot right here, where you're minimizing the interference with law-abiding gun owners and maximizing the effectiveness of the law. And then finally, I think what was most unique about our research and about this policy platform is that it attempts to identify wins for gun owners, believing that this is not a zero-sum game, that it need not be a zero-sum game. It's not a question of, non-gun owners winning and gun owners losing, or gun owners having to sacrifice something in order to protect public safety, which is, I think, the way that it's typically perceived right now. We wanted this to be something where both sides would gain. Gun owners would gain, non-gun owners would gain, and public safety would gain. And we believe that, and I think you'll see why, it's possible to do this in such a way. So what is the common ground? Well, by far, our survey revealed that the common ground is simply the idea that people who are at the highest risk for violence should not be able to purchase or possess a firearm. It's that simple. 80% of gun owners, 81% of gun owners agreed that people who are convicted of a violent crime should not be able to purchase or possess a gun. And so based on that piece of common ground, it turns out that that is enough to put together a meaningful and effective platform of gun laws that is completely consistent with that one principle. So what we did was we took that one principle, people convicted of a violent crime should not be able to purchase or possess a gun, and we developed a three-part platform of policies that simply puts that into law. And the foundation, again, for this platform is that gun policies should ensure that people who are at high risk for violence can't access guns, while at the same time interfering minimally with the ability of law-abiding gun owners to purchase and possess guns. And to achieve this, we put together this package of policies, and here's what it does. So the first thing is you have to establish a sensitive and specific threshold for gun ownership. So in other words, make sure that people who have committed violent crimes can't access guns. Number two, you have to have a very efficient, but also minimally invasive or minimally intrusive method to assess if someone meets that threshold. Third, you have to have a mechanism to prevent someone who already has a gun, but then later meets the threshold from accessing a gun. And the fourth thing is you need a mechanism to temporarily remove guns from someone who is at very high risk of violence. So those are really the four things you need. And here's the policy that we believe can achieve all four of those. So number one, the hallmark of the policy is what we call violent misdemeanor law. And this is a law that prevents firearm possession by anyone who's been convicted of a misdemeanor crime of violence. You may not know that under current federal law, any felony prohibits you from possessing a gun, any felony. So you have someone who committed a non-violent felony, say wire fraud or some sort of securities violation, no guns forever. That person can never own a gun the rest of their lives. Yet, if you have someone who actually commits a violent crime, but it's at the misdemeanor level and not the felony level, with the exception of domestic violence, that person can buy as many guns as they want. And just looking at this, it just doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. Why should a nonviolent criminal be prohibited forever from possessing a gun, but a violent criminal who just happened to, say, plea bargain their offense down to a misdemeanor, be able to get as many guns as they want? And in fact, in Michigan State recently, the tragic shooting there, this is exactly what happened. The perpetrator of that mass shooting committed a crime which should have been a violent felony, but it got prosecuted as a misdemeanor. He was able to somehow plea bargain his way down, as so often happens. And because it was a misdemeanor crime, he was able to legally go out and purchase the guns that he then used in this horrific shooting. So the first thing we want to see happen is to close this loophole. Our research suggests that simply closing that loophole would reduce homicide rates by about close to 20%. We estimate 18% in one study, 19% in another study. So basically, we're getting about a 20% reduction in homicide rates just from that single law that is fixing that loophole, and that is supported, as I said, by 80% of gun owners. It's absurd to us that you have a policy that could drop homicide rates by 20%, and that we're not enacting it because there's this perceived divide. Yet the truth is that 80% of gun owners totally support such a policy. It seems like that seems itself to be a tragedy. Okay, the second policy is you have to have a way to check to see if someone has a violent misdemeanor. And the best way to do that is through a state permit system where you require a permit to purchase or possess a gun. And in order to obtain the permit, you would need to do state and local background checks. And the primary purpose of those checks is to make sure that there's not a history of a violent misdemeanor crime. The evidence shows very strongly that doing background checks at the state and local level are far more effective than doing it at the federal level. And that's for two reasons. First, the ATF, which performs these background checks, part of the FBI, is not very well funded. It takes them a long time to do these checks. And secondly, most of the states are not very good about giving records to the federal government. The federal government is totally reliant on states reporting crimes to them. And so the NICS database, which is used for these background checks, is very poor, and especially poor for the specific types of crimes that we're talking about, the misdemeanor type of crimes, domestic violence crimes. Those are much better reported at the state and local level. Under this system, there would be two types of permits. There would be general permits for possession and then concealed carry permits. And you would require firearm safety training for both. For the concealed carry permitting, it would actually require live shooting training. The permits would be available at low cost, and they would be renewable every 5 years. There would also have to be a mechanism to prevent someone who already has a gun but later commits a disqualifying crime from accessing a gun. And so there would be an immediate reporting of disqualifying crimes to the state, and they would immediately revoke that person's permit. And so this is actually not only the best way to check to conduct the background checks and to see if someone has a history of violent misdemeanors, but it's the quickest way to take away someone's gun if they do commit a crime, even though they have received a permit. So here's the wins for gun owners. There's a lot of them. So first of all, there would be no more need for point of purchase background checks. If I buy a gun today and I pass the check and I go in tomorrow, I have to do another background check. Having a permit system would make it easier for gun owners because they would only have to get their permit once, and then for 5 years, they would not need to do a background check every single time they get a gun. They would be exempt from that background check as long as they had a violent permit. They'd be able to lend guns to family members without fear of felony prosecution. This is a big concern of many gun owners we talk to. They can purchase a gun from a private seller without having to go to a federally licensed facility. Another major concern of gun owners. And perhaps the greatest concern that gun owners have, kind of their biggest pet peeve, is that they cannot cross state lines. When you have a driver's license, your driver's license is accepted in any state. When you have a firearm permit, it's not necessarily accepted, and they want reciprocity. They want to be able to go to other states and not have to get a separate new permit. And so this would allow for permit reciprocity for gun owners as long as the state meets a certain minimum requirements. Our research suggests that this would decrease homicides by somewhere between about 10% and about 16%. And we're using 10% here just as a conservative estimate. The third policy is red flag laws. And this is simply a mechanism to temporarily remove a gun from someone who is at very high risk of causing harm to themselves or others. The evidence on this is extremely strong that they help to prevent suicides. In Indiana, there was a 10% decline in firearm suicides. In Connecticut, a 16% decline. And overall, in all of the states that have passed these laws, there's about a 6% decline in firearm suicide rates. So putting everything together here, we estimate that if this policy package were adopted, it would reduce, the violent misdemeanor law would reduce homicide rates by 20%, state permitting laws an additional 8%. So you would have a 28% reduction in homicide rates and a 6% reduction in suicide rates. So this is an incredible effect that we could have just from this set of 3 policies. Can Maryland lead the way? Well, I think that Maryland can lead the way because it is already a long way towards having these policies. So in terms of the violent misdemeanor law, Maryland is actually one of 4 states that already has that law. So they've kind of already checked that box off. With respect to a state permitting system, Maryland does have a permitting system for handguns. They don't have one for long guns. So the one thing that could be done in Maryland to extend this would be to extend it to long guns. Maryland could also shorten their handgun permits from 10 years to 5 years while waiving point of purchase background checks for people who have a permit. so they could actually ease things up for gun owners at the same time as strengthening the law to include long guns. And Maryland already has a red flag law. So Maryland is very close to having this entire system in place, and I think really can be a leader to show other states what can be done. So finally, the last thing I just want to say is that the key takeaways from our research and our experience working with 97% is first, that there is enough common ground between gun owners and non-gun owners to be able to craft a universal policy that will be supported by both sides and that will be extremely effective in reducing firearm deaths. This is why I'm optimistic. It doesn't take solving the tremendous controversies out there to bring people together across issues that there's a great divide to solve this problem. It only requires getting people to be where they already are, but just to get them to talk to each other and to put their agreement into law. There's no need to dwell on the controversial policies that tend to alienate gun owners. And finally, I want to close by saying that bringing gun owners into gun violence prevention would truly be a game changer. If gun owners were to start to get up and say, hey, I support these laws, this is not going to be an infringement on my rights, it would truly be a game changer.
Dr.
And
Siegel.
I'm just going to close with a
Well, Dr.
picture.
Siegel,
Yeah.
can you talk for a second about how you know that? Because you did this on tobacco.
Yes, exactly. So the reason why we feel this way is that we haven't. I've worked in the tobacco issue for many years, and initially we were getting trounced because the tobacco industry was framing this as an issue of smokers versus non-smokers. And there was this perceived intractable divide between the interests of smokers and non-smokers. And what we did successfully in that movement was to reframe the issue from being, instead of being smokers versus non-smokers, we turn it into the public, smokers and non-smokers alike, versus big tobacco. And that's really what I think ultimately we need to do with gun violence, because that is what the battle is. The battle is not between gun owners and non-gun owners. The real battle is between all of us, the public, gun owners and non-gun owners, versus the tobacco lobby and groups like the NRA, which absolutely do not want to see any law passed, even the most sensible laws. And if we can transform that, like we did with the tobacco issue, I think that's going to be a game changer. And I'll just close with a picture of a game changer who you are probably all familiar with. And sadly to say, for Baltimore fans, you no longer have this game changer, but I'm not going to rub that in. So thank you so much for your time, and I'm sure we're all happy to answer any questions that you have.
Well, I want to thank all our speakers for truly excellent presentations that offer us so much food for thought and discussion. But I'd like to begin by seeing whether Senator Waldstreicher or Matt or Michael, you have questions for each other. Is there something you would like to comment on that you heard, or a question you'd like to ask one of your fellow panelists before we go to general Q&A? Any questions that you might have for them? No? We'll go for it. All right, then we'll go for it. So we'll go to Q&A now. And of course, I will ask that we're inviting everyone to engage in this discussion, and of course, in a spirit of courtesy and respect. And I'll ask that you come up to the mic if you have a question. Right over here, Lisa Reisner is going to be traffic cop at the mic. And if you're in the Zoom, you put your question in the chat, and our Zoom moderator, Bill Reisner, will alternate between the room and the Zoom. And if you'd like to, please tell us who you are. And if you'd like to, please tell us if you're a gun owner or a non-gun owner. And in order to give everyone a chance to comment, if you have a question, please be sure that it's a question. And if you have a thought to share, the bottom line. We'll welcome the bottom line. Okay, so would anyone like to begin? Oh, you're there. Okay, Christina, thank you.
My name is Chris Files. I've been working on gun violence for about 7 years with the National Cathedral, and I'm co-chair of the DC area Interfaith Gun Violence Prevention Network. I have a quick comment and a question for Dr. Siegel and Mr. Littman. My comment is to find common ground. I think we have to get rid of the term gun control and talk about gun safety. I'm very frustrated that the media will not drop this term. My question for Dr. Siegel, could you give us an idea of how many violent misdemeanors there are? And for Mr. Littman, it seems to me there's a divide between all the gun owners out there who are very reasonable and want to do something to solve gun violence, and these far-right gun owner groups. How do we bridge that divide?
Yeah, I'll jump in first, Dr. Siegel, if you don't mind, but that is the exact question, which is that you're asking. So thank you for that question. It is the minority of gun owners that don't support any changes are the loudest voices. You're absolutely right. And getting that 84% of gun owners, for example, that we talked about before, that favor some types of gun reforms, getting that group to be heard more is what we're trying to do. So your question is right on the money, and I'll give you a perfect example of this. Was we were in a conversation with somebody who's on the far right on gun issues, and he said to me, I want to testify before Congress on gun issues. And I said, why do you want to do that? And he said, because I'm the loudest voice and Congress should only listen to the loudest voices. And I said, that's the opposite of what we're trying to do. So, getting people to be heard and feeling comfortable being heard is a big charge for us, and getting gun owners out there to say we feel this way, we're the majority of folks. That's what we're trying to do. So, and it's not easy to do, right? So, anything that comes up, these other groups are on top of it. The Gun Owners of America, they're on top of it immediately. They're making hundreds of phone calls. Getting gun owners comfortable and explaining to members of Congress, this is where your constituents are, for example, that is what we're trying to do. Dr.
Thank
Siegel.
you.
Yeah, regarding Christine's very good question, the first question about what types of violent or how many violent misdemeanors are, there's a whole slew of these. There's a lot of violent crimes that can be prosecuted as misdemeanors and that don't necessarily get to the level of a felony. So first of all, you have basically assault and battery, just basic assault and battery. But you also have other crimes like stalking, now cyber stalking, harassment, making threats of violence. And in addition, you have crimes that are prosecuted or that actually should be felonies, but people have bargained them down to a misdemeanor. So the problem is that with our criminal justice system, as you know, very often, if you have, especially if you're white and especially if you have resources, you can afford the top lawyers, you can get these crimes knocked down to lower levels. And so that's what's happening. And when they get knocked down to misdemeanors, you're off the hook in terms of owning guns. So there's both a lot of categories of crimes that are included here, but there's also the issue of the criminal justice system and having these crimes not being prosecuted at the level that they should be.
And Dr. Siegel, there are 2 states that have those violent misdemeanor laws, correct?
So there's actually 4 states. Maryland is one of them, and the only others are Connecticut, Hawaii, and California.
Thank you. One more here, then we'll go to Zoom. Okay.
Hello, my name is Jessica Langerman, and I'm just a concerned citizen. I want to thank you so much for your excellent and pragmatic work on this issue, and also thank Senator Waldstreicher for all of his work. Perhaps you were beginning to kind of get close to this question earlier. I was curious about the how you did not include domestic abuse violence in the proposed policy for violent misdemeanors, being as domestic abusers very frequently are violent. And so I was curious about that.
Well, so just to make it very clear, domestic violence related misdemeanors are included. It's so basically any violent misdemeanor would be included in the definition of violent misdemeanor. There are no exceptions. So any domestic violence related crime, no matter what level it's prosecuted at, whether it's prosecuted as a felony or as a misdemeanor, would be included. The only reason that I'm not emphasizing that in the examples is because fortunately, federal law does now include domestic violence misdemeanors. It's the one exception. It's the one type of misdemeanor that federal law does include as a disqualifying factor for gun ownership. And it was the reason it was very weak just before last summer when the bipartisan bill passed was because there was an exception. It was called the boyfriend loophole, but basically dating partners were not included in that law. One of the things that the Safer Communities Act did, this bipartisan law that Matt talked about earlier, is it closed that loophole. So now it doesn't matter what relationship you are with the perpetrator is with the victim, any domestic violence misdemeanor is disqualifying for gun purchase. So thanks for mentioning that specifically so that I could point that out.
Bill, can we go to a question from Zoom, please?
Sure, I'll read some from, there's a lot of questions coming in on the chat. I'm not sure if we'll get to them all, but I'll just go in order. So Robin Gerber had a question. What can you say, I believe this is to either Matt or to Dr. Siegel, what can you say to gun rights proponents who oppose gun permits because they fear that the records could be used in the future for confiscation reasons?
Dr. Siegel, you want to jump on that one?
Yeah, so basically what I would say is that two things. First of all, the government can already jump on finding out who has weapons and confiscating those weapons if they want to. Every time a gun owner goes into a store to buy a weapon, there's a form called a Form 4473 that has to be filled out. It's a very intrusive form. It asks all about your personal life. It asks about whether you use cannabis, whether you have any criminal history. It asks about your drinking habits and your smoking habits, and it's pretty intrusive. It also records the make, model, and serial number of all your guns. And the ATF has access to this anytime they want. They can walk into a store any day and just ask for all of those records. So I would say, first of all, we already essentially have a national gun registry just by the nature of the record keeping that's required. The second thing is that our proposal for a permit system would actually be much less intrusive because this permit database would only include the name of the person and whether or not they are excluded or not, whether or not they have a valid permit or not. And so it would be a lot less intrusive. It wouldn't include every single gun they have. So it would be good for 5 years. Every time you wanted to buy a gun, you could get you wouldn't need a new background check, and there would actually be no record of the gun that you purchased, at least from the state's perspective. So we think it would actually be a lot less intrusive than the current system.
Thank you. Bill, one more from Zoom, and then we'll come back to the room.
Okay, sure. So Harriet had a question about assault weapons, again, for Matt or Dr. Siegel. I guess I'll just paraphrase it. What are the implications, or what, in terms of your research or other thoughts, distinctions for assault weapons versus other types of guns?
So we'll talk about that one for a second. So the key for our organization versus a lot of the other great organizations is we work on where gun owners and non-gun owners agree. And on weapons, they don't agree. So 34% of gun owners, for example, favor an assault weapons ban. So our focus is, where are the areas of agreement and what can we do about it? That's not an area of agreement. So there are plenty of groups, as I said, and as you know many of these groups already, that are doing work on assault weapons. Because that's not an area of agreement, that's not where we come in. The other thing I just want to mention is, the area that we do come in on is what Dr. Siegel talked about a lot, this misdemeanor law. If you've committed a violent crime, that's a misdemeanor, you should not be able to get a gun. That will reduce gun violence, homicides by over 19%. That is a very significant, that's the most significant thing we could do to reduce deaths. The other thing, and I know Dr. Siegel's going to say this, so I'm going to say before he does, is that gun owners are very focused on the area before you get the weapon. Once you get a gun, gun owners don't really want the government involved. It's before you get that gun. So that's the reason, for example, that universal background checks are so favored. This misdemeanor law thing is so favored. So Dr. Siegel, I turn it over to you on that one.
Yes, so I think Matt is exactly right on this. What I can add, though, is that from a research perspective, we did not find that assault weapon bans are effective in reducing firearm homicide, either in general or in the setting of mass shootings. And I think the reason for this is that it's difficult to define assault weapons. And typically they're defined by cosmetic features of the gun. And it is just simply too easy for the manufacturer to just change those cosmetic features. So you can literally take an AR-15, and you can just simply remove a couple of the features, the cosmetic features of it, and turn it into a weapon that's no longer an assault weapon. If you take off the barrel shroud, if you make sure you take off the pistol grip, if you make sure that the stock is not folding, that it's not telescoping, make sure that you take a bayonet lug off if there is one, you no longer have an assault weapon. So essentially, the moment you pass an assault weapon ban, what the manufacturers are going to do is you're just going to take those features off the gun, but it's still going to be the same AR-15. The shooting rate will be the same. The power will be the same. So unfortunately, you can try to ban these guns, but the manufacturers are not stupid. They're just going to kind of reinvent the guns and repackage the guns in a way that is going to be technically legal, but it doesn't get them off the streets. And so that's the problem with the assault weapon bans.
The assault weapon ban means different things to different people. And unfortunately, there's no one answer to, we're going to do this and then gun violence is going to be gone. 3% of homicides are with an assault weapon, 1% of overall gun deaths are with an assault weapon. Assault weapons are super scary, no doubt about it. And I think we're seeing them, the number of deaths with an assault weapon increase. So that is very frightening. However, in terms of what we're doing specifically, assault weapons is not at this point something that we're involved in, because we're trying to bring in the common ground. And we believe that that common ground reduces gun deaths in the most significant way.
Thank you. Please.
My name is Lois Weaver. I chair the gun violence prevention team at National United Methodist Church in Washington, D.C. I'd like to know if 97% has reached out to the Second Amendment caucus in the United States House.
I don't necessarily know what the Second Amendment caucus is. However, I will tell you that we've met with dozens of House Republicans. So, not everybody we've met with members of Congress, for example, that have an A+ NRA rating. And one of those meetings was very interesting, because when Dr. Siegel and we went in to that meeting with former Congressman Joe Walsh. Let me just take a step back for a second. Our advisory board is very bipartisan. We have 2 former NRA lobbyists on our advisory board, for example. And the reason for that is because even those people believe in background checks and red flag laws. So there's common ground. So when we go into these meetings with House Republicans, for example, we're able to say we have this very bipartisan group of people who agree on many, many issues. So, you're talking about this congressman with an A+ NRA rating. When we went in there, they were giving us a very hard time. By the time we left, they said they did not realize about this loophole on violent misdemeanor laws, that they didn't know that, and they were interested in talking about that more. So there are areas of common ground that we think that we could work on, even with people with an A+ NRA rating.
Thank you. Please.
Yes, I'm a member of Bethesda United Methodist Church, which has also been working on this for quite a while with Norwood and others. I had another question, but now one came up when you discussed assault weapons. I wondered if there's any use to trying to ban or reduce high capacity ammunition, which might be more defined. The other question I originally had was in the state permit system. That sounds interesting. You mentioned for reciprocity across states that there would be a minimum requirement in the state. And I wondered if you have worked that out yet, because that sounds like a place people might argue.
Dr. Siegel, I have ones for you, I think.
Okay, so two great questions. First, yes, the minimal requirement for the permit system would be our policy platform. So it would be this 3-part policy platform. So a state would have to have a permit system to obtain or to purchase or possess a gun. It would have to have a disqualifier for any violent misdemeanor crimes. It would have to conduct state and local background checks, and it would have to have a red flag law. So if it met all those background requirements, then a permit from that state would be valid in all other states. If it didn't meet those requirements, then it wouldn't. And this would be a huge incentive, by the way, to get states to pass these laws, this package of laws, because they would know that it would provide tremendous benefits to people in their state, to gun owners in their state. One argument that they could make to defend their actions would be to say, hey, look, we're just trying to get you concealed carry reciprocity throughout the country. That would be an easy way to appease the gun owners. The second question you asked was a brilliant one, because I think you're absolutely right that the issue is not assault weapons. The issue is the capacity of the magazines. And there is strong evidence that if you reduce the capacity of ammunition magazines, you actually do reduce the number of casualties in a mass shooting, because a number of rounds that are in the magazine is really what determines how long the shooter can fire until they have to reload. And the process of reloading, especially if it's an inexperienced gun owner, which many of these perpetrators are, can take a long time. The magazines can jam. And this is exactly what stopped the Gabby Giffords tragedy from there being more deaths, because the shooter was trying to reload, it jammed, and that was enough for there to be an intervention. So I think that a ammunition magazine limit would be effective. We didn't include it in our policy platform, mainly because it's not supported by the majority of gun owners, and we wanted to keep our platform to the common ground. However, I think that the law makes sense, and I think it would save lives.
And Dr. Siegel, it's Jeff. I'm sitting in the front here, but we do have an ammunition capacity limit here in Maryland of 10.
Yes, and those are exactly the type of laws that we found that reduce the number of casualties when there is a mass shooting. It's not going to prevent it, obviously, from happening, but if it does happen, it will reduce the number of casualties.
Thank you. Please.
My name is Gary Hayes. I'm a gunman. I'm educated. I'm retired military, volunteer, and I belong to Bethesda United Methodist Church. I was very happy today to see a lot of the compromises or common ground, I don't know. It's more than I've seen before. Very happy to see it on it. There is one area I need to disagree with, having to do with gun registration. A gentleman on Zoom asked about, okay, the registered gun has up and forget, confiscation later. And the gentleman stated, well, they're already registered. So if they want to get confiscated, they can. Well, that's only for new purchase. Truthfully, I have a number of guns, which the government does not know anything about. If I go buy a new gun, they know about this new weapon that I purchased. But they are not aware of any of my older guns. Now, I have weapons since I was 12 years old. I have weapons that my dad gave me when I was young. So, yes, those guns are not going to go away. And if I have to register them, then if they do decide to confiscate them later, they would consider it. Another comment about the magazine capacity. The state of California has limited magazine capacity to 8 rounds. That is, okay, another thing about this is I am a competitive gun shooter. I've reached a high level of skill in that sport. What we do, we fire 2 rounds, change magazines, then fire 8 more rounds. That's part of the competition. So California has limited magazines at 8 rounds, and that is satisfactory for competition. So when we talk about magazine capacity limitations, the devil's in the detail. So what would the limitation be? So we need to satisfy all areas. So I'm a gun owner, but I'm a guest gun buyer. So there's a common ground, and I see a lot of it. So we need to continue to work for the common ground. Thank you.
Well, we appreciate that comment. Thank you.
Could we, could you repeat? was the
Maybe,
question-
I don't know if Matt or Dr. Siegel would like to respond.
I couldn't really hear that too well. I don't know about you, Dr. Siegel. Was there, I heard some of it, but was there a question?
I think he was making a point about registration. Dr. Siegel had stated that under our current system, essentially, there's a lot of information in the system that amounts to a gun being registered, basically, with a lot of information. And this gentleman was commenting that he owns guns that may not be known to the government. So the issue of registration.
Dr. Siegel,
there?
I don't.
Dr.
I'm
Siegel,
not
are
sure
you
what the question was.
there?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, it is true that yeah, there are a lot of guns that the government is not going to know about because they're only going to know about new gun purchases, where the Form 4473 is filled out. Guns that were inherited or, given by a family member, they're not going to know about. This, I have to say, this is one of the biggest concerns of gun owners. The idea that there's going to be a registry out there that, is going to take away their firearms. The idea of a registry, as soon as you mention it, you're going to lose gun owner support for any policy. It's going to disappear instantaneously as soon as you talk about having a registry. And our research finds that registries are not effective in reducing homicide. So we looked at states that have laws that have formal firearm registries, and there is no reduction in homicide. Where the registry is potentially helpful is in solving crimes, because the registry is not going to stop you from it's not going to stop a crime, but it may help you to identify who the perpetrator was when a crime is committed. I'm not sure that those benefits are enough to outweigh the huge opposition that we're getting from gun owners in terms of what we could accomplish without the registry. And as I said, I think there's so much information that's already out there. If you really want to know who has what kind of gun, you can find out, just like you can find out pretty much any product that someone has. You just go to the credit card companies, and the credit card companies are already selling information on gun purchases to the public. So if you really want to know who has guns, you just go to the credit card companies and you can already find this information out.
Thank you. I'll take one more from Zoom and then we'll come to you, okay? Bill, one more from Zoom.
Sure, just reading down through the chat. I'm going to paraphrase a question from Bob Tiller. So Matt and Dr. Siegel, a lot of this conversation has been focused on obviously discussions with gun owners and work with legislators. The question was getting at manufacturers. So what is the role of, in terms of your organization, Matt, but then also more broadly, what is the role of either advocacy or pressure on manufacturers in your efforts?
So it's interesting, our goal is where do gun owners and non-gun owners agree, right? So gun manufacturers is really not where we're involved. However, when we talk about, there's a company, it's now based in Colorado called BioFire. They make a smart gun, and I'm bringing that up because a few years ago when smart gun technology was coming up, Remington, which was in bankruptcy, was offered about $600 million or something like that by a Native American tribe to turn Remington into a smart gun company, and Remington said no, because they didn't want to get involved in smart guns, right? So that seems like a crazy decision. They're bankrupt. But that technology was not something that they favored. That's a gun manufacturer. So that company, there's a company now, this company BioFire, which just came out of the smart gun like a week ago. And our people helped them get some investment. We're not involved in it. We didn't invest in it. But that company has been around now on Capitol Hill, and there was a lot of news about it last week. Again, it's another thing that would make a gun safer because you'd have to have fingerprint technology. That's the way that we've been involved with gun manufacturers. And we talked about that company, Vera, that makes the safes. That's the way we've been involved. We only focus on areas where gun owners and non-gun owners agree. Dr. Siegel, do you know anything about gun manufacturers and that sort of stuff?
Well, I think I'm glad that Bob mentioned that point, because when I was saying that we need to change the debate from gun owners versus non-gun owners to the public versus the gun lobby, he's right. I should have included gun manufacturers. It's the gun industry, including the gun lobby. And in fact, the gun manufacturers are very much behind the gun lobby. So for example, the NRA is not just an independent group of gun owners. It's heavily supported by the manufacturers. The gun manufacturers are heavily supporters of the NRA. And you go to an NRA convention and you're going to be loaded, you're going to be surrounded by the gun manufacturers. So they are strongly related. I think that with the gun manufacturers, there is an interesting possibility to get some of them involved and to kind of split the field. And with BioFire, as Matt was talking about, creating smart guns, it really could create competition, because once you have one company that is out there selling smart guns, then the other companies are going to want to follow suit because they're going to lose that market.
That's right.
And so we can use kind of the economic incentives in the market to try to get at this problem as well. And eventually, when enough companies have these products available, it will be possible to pass legislation that requires them. We can't do that now, because if we do that now, no company will make that product.
Well, that happened to folks.
That did happen.
Let me just give that example, Siegel.
Sure.
So I don't know what folks know about this, but in the early 2000s, the state of New Jersey passed a law. This actually, I think, happened in Bethesda. The state of New Jersey passed a law that said that when smart guns become available, all guns in New Jersey that are sold need to be smart guns, right? So a couple of years later, a guy, I think it was in Bethesda, at his shop starts selling like the first smart guns. He does not know about this law in New Jersey. So people start calling this guy, threatening to kill him. He has no idea that there's a law in New Jersey that says New Jersey can only sell smart guns once smart guns become available. So now New Jersey, with that law, they walked it back recently to say, You also, I think this is right, Dr. Siegel, you also need to sell smart guns if you're selling guns. They just walked that law back a couple of years ago. But as Dr. Siegel is saying, and it's true with this company Vera as well, that technology has been surprisingly slow to come up, mostly because these legacy gun manufacturers haven't wanted it. So now that these independent groups outside of them are starting to do this work with smart technology, at some point there'll be critical mass. These companies will want to get involved in that field, and that's our hope.
Thank you. Please, we'll turn to you.
I had a bunch of kids, so I know how to speak loud.
We want to make sure they can hear you on Zoom.
Hello,
See if that works.
does this work? Is this working?
Yeah,
This
good.
is working.
Yes, yes.
My name is Steve Corbin. I too am a gun owner. And I'm part of a family that has survived gun violence. But I'm also a public health professional career. And I'm so encouraged by the approach I saw here that was evidence-based, analytical, looking for the sweet spots of a public health approach. And I think they're putting the public and health in the same approach and not trying to go for every fringe issue because they can't handle it all. But I think there's a challenge that remains. I spent a lot of time in Annapolis. You probably remember me from some dunking, both in committee meetings, hearings, floor debates, votes, the whole thing. I spent most of my time listening to the folks who were opposed to these types of bills because I knew what the rest of us were going to say. And there were canards that came up. The good guy with the gun. I'm going to give you a list of 4 here and then ask. I'm not sure who's the most appropriate respondent to this. The good guy with the gun. The idea that arming every adult over the age of 18 in the United States so that they will always be prepared everywhere, all the time, for every exigency as an approach. The mental health canard, I'm really concerned about because it's such an easy one to go to. And then there's the anecdote side. So this is an evidence-based approach, but I hear a lot of anecdotes. In fact, I'm willing to use some anecdotes to open a discussion, but they can't in the end be the thing that drives evidence-based rational policy making. So I'd like to pose to any of our panelists, don't we have to spend at least some time holding these alternative approaches to an proof of evidence standard, even if it's a middle one? It can't just be, well, I heard that since the permitting liberalized in Maryland for carrying guns, handguns, there's been no increase of any crime whatsoever. That was like 70 days after the bill had passed. So I really appreciate how much time do we have to spend, not just going on the positive proposals, but trying to deal with the alternatives and whether or not they make any sense at all. And can we address them in a sensible, rational, patient fashion?
Great question.
Thank you for the question. I'll come up and, well, let's start with this. So you know that there are counter anecdotes that we've heard about so much in the news over the past few weeks. So let's start with this idea that an armed society is a polite society. So if you went out from my door and have the wrong address, my person's it's not that I am, my person thinks is being polite and to help and say this isn't the right code. Same thing if someone turns into my driveway, turn around, or again at the wrong, the idea that an armed society is a polite society. Over the last few weeks, we've learned that is exactly the type of scenario that the other side wants out there. That is clearly not. The other idea that you mentioned is this, a good guy with a gun. So let's use last night as an example. So Texas is the most heavily armed state in the United States. And indeed, an officer took out the perpetrator. We don't know many details. We don't know the name or what the perpetrator's motivations were last night, but we do know that he killed 8 people before an officer who is already on scene for another crime, or anyone else who was armed in that mall, because Texas, as we just determined, is highly armed, we're able to neutralize the threat. That's 8 lives destroyed, and of course, the lives of their family members and friends forever altered as well. And so what we're seeing with the dramatic increase in gun violence, and especially gun violence against children, is that an increasing amount of guns means an increasing amount of gun violence, full stop. And here's where it gets challenging, and it gets challenging especially for those who are working with gun owners. And I'm sensitive. I mean, I think it's a great strategy. I'm glad we're doing it. And thank you to our 2 other guests here today. But we also know that legal guns find their way into the stream of illegal commerce, that the more guns we have overall, the more illegal guns we have on our street. And so when gun rights folks point to the increase in violence in our community, and in my state, here in Maryland, it's heavily racialized, often referring to Baltimore City, but we know that there's been an increase in gun violence, not only in Baltimore City, but here in Montgomery County, next door in Prince George's County, next door in District of Columbia. Those guns are coming from somewhere. All of those guns, almost all of those guns, I should say, started as legally purchased weapons and found their way through the stream of commerce into illegal hands. And so let's stop pretending that these 2 issues are separate, that mass shootings and urban violence are somehow 2 different things at all times, and that the solutions to one is not necessarily the solution to the other. Overall, the more guns you have, the more violence you're going to have. And that's what you're seeing statistically in Texas. That's what you're seeing anecdotally across the country. And we just need to say it exactly as you said it. We need to say it out loud. We need to push back against the other side that is creating these false narratives that guns somehow create safety. And that's what we're doing in Maryland. And so, Dr. Siegel.
Totally agree with your great senator. I think we have like 113 guns for every 100 people in the United States. Obviously, not every person who has a gun is equipped to have one, and we do need to conquer that.
Dr. Siegel, any comment?
I think that the senators, I just want to applaud the senator's last comment as well, because I think that there's a tendency to, view mass shootings as being a completely separate, there's a completely separate set of policies that we need. And our research actually showed that that wasn't true. Our research showed that, in fact, the single most effective way to prevent mass shootings is to have a state permit requirement. In fact, it was the only law that actually is capable of reducing mass shootings. And so I think that there's this general principle that, and I know the 97% kind of really supports this, but there's a general principle that the most important thing you can do to prevent gun violence is to regulate who has access to guns and to keep guns out of the hands of people who are dangerous and who shouldn't have them. That is the most important thing you can do. And if you can do that, you're going to reduce suicides, you're going to reduce homicides, and you're going to reduce mass shootings as well. You get all 3 benefits from these laws. And that's why we're pushing this basic universal set of policies that we hope every state will implement, like Maryland has. There's no reason why, people who have committed violence should have access to guns, especially when 80% of gun owners, the overwhelming majority of the public, agrees with these policies. So it's a double tragic situation. The first tragedy is the gun violence. And the second tragedy is that we have solutions that the public overwhelmingly supports and could easily be implemented, but we're not seeing them implemented. To me, that is a double tragedy.
Well, in your efforts to try to bring together people who care about this issue, gun owners, non-gun owners, and redefine the debate, as you were saying earlier, between the NRA and the gun lobby, is really crucial. I think we're going to have to take our last question now. It's our friend Matt Melhoff. And
I could be loud too.
No, you can use, I'll give you my mic if that's not working. Okay.
Hi, Matt Melhoff. I'm owner as well. Those are my kids over there. I believe in,
We are having trouble hearing on the Zoom.
Okay, let me just give you mine.
it's okay. I can talk like.
No, but they can't hear you on Zoom. So I will just give you this. There you go.
That's okay.
Just put it on your t-shirt.
Thank you.
Voila.
So, oh, now I'm too loud. My name is Matt Melhoff. I'm a gun owner as well. My two small children are here with me because their mom's out of town. I believe in biometric safe, so I have one. I believe in safe storage. I believe in liability, criminal and civil for people who can't secure their guns. That's just that. But the reason why I got up here was the prior gentleman who spoke about the talking points of the other side. I have a foot in both of these worlds, and it's very difficult for me to even have the same conversation when I'm getting into an information environment that's entirely different from my own. Common ground requires common understanding. I would like, maybe you could talk to us more about how you are breaking into the information environments that are out there that create it so that we're talking about, in my case, I'm a moderate, very moderate person, not political. And yet, when I go into one side of things, I'm cast as a liberal. And when I'm on the other side of things, I'm cast as a conservative. And I feel like the middle of us, the people who are the common ground, need a way to speak in an environment where we're talking about the same thing and getting the information that you guys are getting out there, getting it out there to everybody and finding a common way to talk about, a common way to agree on the things that we agree on. So if you could comment about how you propose we could do a better job of that, please.
Matt, that's the greatest question. Thank you for asking it. It's, the thing about the common, so we try to do this as much as possible, which is talk to everybody about the issues so that people understand that almost all Americans care very much about this issue and want to do something about it. And that's the place to start, right? We all want to see less deaths. We want to see less gun violence. So understanding that just because somebody doesn't agree with you on everything does not make them a horrible person. People come from different backgrounds. People have different views on a lot of issues. Most people want to see reduction in gun violence for sure. So, the thing that we try to do is we work with gun rights organizations like the National African American Gun Association. We talk to the folks at Brady. We talk to everybody. They're all good people. And we have these conversations. And as you've heard today, Matt, what we try to do is, us specifically, is provide evidence for this position. Dr. Siegel talks to gun rights groups about how to ask questions in a poll. And the reason we do that is because what gun owners will often say is a poll is conducted to get you the answer that you want already. And we want to make sure that we're not doing that, right? So we want to make sure we're not asking leading questions. And we want to have these conversations to say the Second Amendment exists. What can we do to make people safer in this country? And we do find, as Dr. Siegel has said, that in fact, there is a lot of common ground. Once you start getting down deeper into some of these issues, there are disagreements, but there is a lot of common ground. And a lot of that common ground doesn't mean, listen, if you don't believe in universal background checks, you're not a horrible person. You just may disagree on the issue. We could agree there are areas of agreement here. And so we try to have these conversations with folks as often as possible to show the vast majority of people feel a certain way. Doesn't mean you're a terrible person if you disagree. Let's talk about it. I think all of us in this room would agree that in this country, when you disagree now, a lot of people will say you're a horrible person, but you're not necessarily, you're not. People disagree on a lot of different issues, and being able to talk about these things calmly and rationally without a lot of prejudgments, I think would be very helpful. Dr. Siegel?
I think that, these are really critical points. I think that there are a lot of things that we in public health have to do in order to be able to talk to gun owners. And in addition to doing research, what I've spent a lot of my time doing is just talking to gun owners and listening to gun owners. And I'll tell you, the very first thing I did when I decided to get into the gun violence field was not review all the evidence about gun violence, although I, of course, did that. But the very first thing I did is I called the detective in my town and I said, hey, can you take me shooting? Can you take me out to the shooting range? Because I felt that unless I had actually experienced what it was like to shoot a gun and what it was like to go to the range and just to be in the social environment and hear how gun owners talk to each other, learn a little bit about gun safety. The other thing I started doing is going into gun stores and talking to gun owners of gun stores and just talking to gun owners everywhere as much as I could. And you need to do that in order to be able to bridge the divide. Because you're right, it is almost like two different cultures in a way. And I think that for me, learning about guns has made a huge difference in my ability to understand gun culture and to communicate with gun owners on a, essentially even ground where we're not in two different worlds. And that's critical. And I think that's what 97% is doing by bringing these groups together. It's really allowing both sides to learn each other's worlds and to learn how they communicate. And I thank you for your point, because I think that ultimately that's going to be what's necessary, is to bridge these worlds of gun owners and non-gun owners. So truly it is a unified public who is going up against the gun lobby and the gun companies. And just one final thought, which is that similar to in tobacco is when we got when we got smokers and non-smokers together. I think it's the same thing here. When we get gun owners and non-gun owners together, united against the gun lobby, is when we're really going to be able to be powerful and have an effect.
Thank you so much. I'm sure that we here at St. John's Norwood, would agree that the first step is to sit down and talk to the other and not write people off because we have even difficult disagreements. So we appreciate the work you all are doing. Before I close, I just wanted to recognize a couple of other participants. We have our state delegate, Jared Solomon, online. I don't know, Jared, are you there?
I am, yes.
Well, we want to thank you too, because we know that you have worked hard on this issue. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Sorry, we have a sick baby, so I had to come back to make sure I was helping my wife with our 3-year-old. It's almost nap time, so glad to be able to join by Zoom.
We are delighted that you are here, and thank you for the support. And we also have the Sheriff of Montgomery County here, Maxwell Weed. Thank you very much for joining us. And I would really like just to thank and applaud all of you, and thank you for coming today. Thank you for caring so much about this issue. Unabated gun violence in America affects all of us. It's not just the victims who suffer the terrible deaths and the families and friends. It's our society. It's our communities. So having you here shows that you care, and it means so much. And unfortunately, the reason this keeps happening is because we collectively as a society are allowing it to happen. It's a choice. It's a choice. And we can change this. And we're truly in a moment when all of us individually and collectively need to take action for change, or we're complicit in what's happening. And what I heard today was really a voice of hope that we can come together and find ways to basically defeat those who would not want to see any change and are accepting a status quo that we know is unconscionable and cannot continue in a civilized society. So, especially if you're a gun owner, thank you to those of you who came today. Raise your voices, you'll be heard. We need you. We need your help in order to solve this problem. Call, text, email, visit your legislators. Please, everyone, act when you leave here. And here we have a handy handout that tells you what you can do in 2 minutes, what you can do in 5 minutes, what you can do in a day if you can take action. But they need to hear from us, because we heard from these gentlemen about the phone calls that roll in from the groups to the right of the NRA. We have to be equally vocal. But I want to thank you, Senator Waldstreicher, for coming. I thank you, Dr. Siegel. I thank you, Matt Littman, for all the incredible work that you're doing. We want to stay in touch. You know we're here. You know we're working in the same way that you are. So please, let's make sure that we do stay in touch and make a change, make a change in this country. Thank you all. Yeah.